Today, the two of us are going to talk about the surgeon's guide to buying a practice. I'm Bhagwan Satyani. I'm a vascular surgeon by background, currently professor emeritus and academy professor at The Ohio State University. I was in private practice for 25 years and in academic practice for another 15. I've taught practice management to physicians and residents and also directed the Faculty Leadership Institute at the Wexner Medical Center at OSU until 2018. Ms. Bailey?
Thanks so much for allowing me to join you. My name is Jessica Bailey Wheaton. I am an attorney by trade, and I serve as Senior Vice President and General Counsel at Health Capital Consultants, which is a healthcare, financial, and economic consulting firm. Our bread and butter work is valuations, fair market value opinions, commercial reasonableness analyses, and other types of regulatory consulting. So a lot of my work centers on the research necessary to support those certified opinions of value related to fair market value and commercial reasonableness of healthcare transactions.
So let's start with laying the background a little bit. Even though the number of physicians in, quote, private practice, end quote, has dropped to about a quarter last year in 2021, we still own a significant number of practices in the U.S. So this change has occurred because of various things. Economic conditions, of course, including inflation, the debt incurred, workforce shortages, burnout, isolation, and of course, the increasing administrative burdens. Right now, unfortunately, there's plentiful capital in the hands of private equity and, of course, some insurance companies that has allowed them to buy out medical and surgical practices owners, particularly older ones looking to get out with the hope of profiting in maybe 3 to 7 years when they sell off the practice. But it also represents an opportunity for younger physicians. A number of surgeons, like when I started, liked the features of a private practice. These include the autonomy, both clinical and business. I think more productivity and satisfaction with particularly the EMR, and the ability to preserve the traditional relationship we all love with our patients rather than just being on the clock. The independent surgeons also prefer the ability to adapt to the changing landscape pretty quickly and nimbly and more efficiently than a bureaucratic employment model. In general, if you look at what we use as a decision making in terms of when to buy and how to buy, this starts with looking for a practice, then determining the purchase price, and we'll go through the various steps of purchasing, selling, buying, and then the contracts and warranties that are involved. And then what the transaction's like. How do you acquire the practice? How do you value it, which Jessica is going to talk about? We also touch on some tax issues, the listing of assets, liabilities, what's included in those, non-compete clauses, and other regulatory issues that come up, and finally, how to do the transaction at the end, how to close up the deal. So I'm going to turn to Jessica to go to the next step, which is, Ms. Bailey, what is your experience with how we should look for a practice and the important factors involved?
Sure. So in a lot of the physicians we've worked with and medical practices, it kind of spans the entire spectrum. So a buyer for an existing surgical practice could be an individual, or it could be a larger single entity or a multi-subspecialty surgical practice. So since the cost of doing business is increasing, a larger or a super group, as they call them, may be able to leverage their size and get economies and efficiencies of scale, particularly including their contractual negotiations with insurance companies and payors. And before reviewing the details of the financial and the legal parts of the purchase or the buy-in of a surgical practice, I think it's important for the buyer to be clear about their goals and their priorities in evaluating and choosing that practice. Especially for a first-time buyer, the priorities are a little bit similar to buying a house, albeit with the addition of a market, right? Being the patients, and the revenue estimates derived from those existing patients. So some of these factors that first-time buyers especially may look at may include the practice type and culture, particularly if you're buying just a share in that practice, the geographic location, the patient population and size specific to the surgical subspecialty. And we're talking a lot about buying existing practice, and there's an advantage to that. And that's if the employees and the patients are already in place, and you dig into the financials and you see that it is a profitable enterprise, you may have a chance to further improve the practice's efficiency with new ideas. So, Dr. Satiani, if you were looking to buy a surgical practice, from your perspective, what kind of setting, practice type, and timeline would be best in your opinion?
So I think we're talking about not only buying an entire surgical practice, but even, like you mentioned, buying part of the practice as you enter as a partner or associate down the road. So first, if I were looking, I'm going to probably narrow my search to probably very few important parameters. And these would include size, location, most important, the referral area involved, what hospitals are affiliated, what the price range is. And for me, especially, would be any teaching opportunities available or residence or fellowships involved. It may not be in some hospitals, it depends on your interest. Second, do I want a solo practice? Do I want a part of a practice or a multi-specialty practice? I think for younger colleagues, some may not be comfortable with making the business decisions, or depending on their training, nervous about performing very complex surgical procedures to start with. In that case, I may prefer to join senior colleagues in a group and on a surgical single specialty group. Another reason to choose the latter option would be if I'm leery of taking call too often and I want a little better work-life balance. So third would be, I'm going to start looking for this opportunity at least 6 and preferably a year before I'm beginning to finish my training and start. Most leads will be obtained through colleagues, your mentors, your faculty in residency or fellowship, some on specialty websites, and of course, journals and their websites. So even if there are no surgical practices sale in the locations you would prefer, it still may be possible to make an offer to an attractive practice run by an older surgeon who you think may be getting to retire soon. It doesn't hurt to ask. Finally, people talk about recruiters. So a recruiter may not be necessary unless there are specific conditions or needs that make it difficult to find the right opportunity in the location you want. So recruiters either work for hospitals or health systems or in-house, or for headhunters, which are recruiting companies. Let's remember that a recruiter does not cost the buyer, and their services are paid by the employer or seller. Now, there are a few large private practice groups that use recruiting companies, and they can certainly afford the cost of it. But in general, most private practice groups work through these other sources I mentioned. So the next step would be, Ms. Bailey, how then should one evaluate a practice to buy?
And how would you go about evaluating that? Let's say you found the practice you're interested in. What factors do you look at?
Well, whether one's intending to buy an existing solo practice or in a surgical specialty group, there are a number of non-business items that I think are very important, in some cases more than the price itself. So, for example, if you were joining a practice, probably the top of the list would be the leadership within the practice. It's important to experience this when you're visiting, to see what the relationship between the person leading this and the employees and the other physicians. Of course, for a younger colleague, the quality of work-life balance is important. So it's important to ask what the call schedule will be, weekday, weekends, vacation time. The other important issue, which would be really important, in my opinion, is the culture of the practice. So this part may take more than one visit and conversations with not only the senior person or physician involved, but business manager. We need to talk to the support staff, maybe the hospital employees where the surgeons interact regularly. So you'll get a pretty decent idea what the culture is of the practice, how employees are treated in general, not just the physicians. The next step would be checking out the reputation in the community. So this you can do with, like we mentioned before, talking to employees, people in the hospital, and you'll get a pretty good idea about how the group or the other surgeon retiring is dealing with patient care, working with others. The other thing would be to check with the Better Business Bureau and other areas about the business reputation. Are there any issues, tax issues, reputation issues with the business? Probably for a surgeon starting out, the part that makes our lives easier is the support staff. So would recommend you check the strength of the support staff. What is their experience? The quality of the people? Are they dedicated to their jobs? And are there enough of them to allow the support staff to focus on patient care? Team care is really important. So looking at the culture in terms of how the support staff works together is really important. And you can observe that on a visit. The next part, of course, these days is technology. Is the technology up to date? What about the EMR? How old is it? How about the computer systems, the quality and the access that you have remotely? Compensation is one part of it. And this is a little more of a detailed conversation, but basically, how is it structured? And one looks at the incentives and benefits. So this could be a whole different conversation. Ms. Bailey, the complexity, I think, is buying a part of practice is pretty huge. And it varies from simple due diligence process to a very detailed, intricate financial and legal process with accountants, attorneys, valuation experts. So this kind of becomes a burden as far as a new person when they're looking. So why don't we start with like a brief outline of typical transactions and the process to follow once somebody has decided on a surgical practice. And the owner has basically said, yes, we agree to sell in principle all or part of the practice. What do we do next?
Sure. So I think at a high level, let's first talk about the types of practice transactions. There's two main types, asset and equity. Asset transactions typically involve the sale of the entirety of the business. So through an asset transaction, the seller can typically identify which specific assets and liabilities they want to assume. There are also some favorable tax treatment for buyers of asset transactions. On the other hand, equity transactions, which are also called stock or membership unit sales, typically occur when a physician is buying a piece of the practice, like we've been talking about throughout this conversation. In that case, you're purchasing a certain percent of interest or a certain number of shares in the business, although you can buy all of the equity in a business. And when you purchase the equity, you can just assume the practice's bank accounts, payor agreements, HR policies, etc. That's a little bit different from asset transactions where you have to transfer those assets. So while it might be easier to simply assume all the assets in an equity transaction, you also assume the practice's liabilities, whether or not you know about those liabilities.
Isn't it the process so complicated for a new surgeon coming out? We're already stressed about different things. Who does the surgeon go to resolve these complexities?
It certainly can be a complicated and stressful time and process, but that's why there are a number of professional advisors that are typically involved in these transactions who can help the physician buyer. For example, legal counsel will draft the contracts and ensure that the terms of the deal do not violate any healthcare laws. Typically, compliance will have a seat at the table from the start to help with the due diligence and to help you uncover exactly what you're buying, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Third, business brokers can help you with a lot of the details of the negotiation and the transaction, such as helping with negotiations surrounding price and how that deal is documented. If evaluation is needed or required, which may be under the practice's bylaws or may be required because of the anti-kickback statute or the Stark Law, you would typically bring in evaluation professionals such as our firm to conduct the fair market value opinion and make sure you're not paying above fair market value. And if needed, perform a commercial reasonableness transaction to ensure that the arrangement itself is commercially reasonable. And then lastly, you likely want to bring in your financial planner or accountant who can help you structure the transaction to be most advantageous to you in regards to taxes, as well as future compensation to ensure that they're in line with your financial goals.
From the transactions I've seen over the years, the timeline varies quite a bit in terms of how quickly this is accomplished and the cost involved. So can you tell us a little bit about what, as far as the timeline and stuff is concerned?
Sure. I think you make a great point that the variability is large in terms of the timeline and the cost. And that's largely because it's dependent on how long the negotiations take and the size of the transaction. Obviously, buying an entire practice is going to take a lot longer than simply buying into a share of the practice. If you're buying the entirety of the practice, that process is going to be expanded because there's a lot more to negotiate. Common items that will require negotiation include price, how that purchase price is going to be paid, whether it's in cash or in installments, for example, whether there is a non-compete or some other restrictive covenant involved, and if the seller is required to work for a certain amount of time to allow patients to become familiar with the new owner, that kind of transition time. And if the buy-in is to own a share of the existing practices, negotiations may be about almost every part of the process, including the valuation, the due diligence, etc. So really, the number of items on the table to negotiate and the size of the transaction will really dictate that timeline. And I would say, most transactions I see go on for a few months at a minimum. So, unfortunately, it's not a really quick deal.
We keep hearing about a couple of different terms. One can Google these terms, but in practical terms, the first one would be, people say due diligence. What does that really mean?
Due diligence is akin to kicking the tires before buying a car. So you want to ensure that you are reviewing and analyzing the company that you're looking to acquire. You want to look at their, the relevant sources of their value and what their risk profile is before doing a deal with that practice. Another goal is you want to identify any risks that are often synonymous with liabilities or hidden costs, as well as any non-compliance with healthcare laws. And finally, to determine if any necessary regulatory filings are needed prior to consummating the deal.
The second term people throw around during negotiations in selling or buying is fair market value. What does that imply? Does that mean there's a specific amount or percentage, or is it generally a general term?
So a practical way to frame fair market value, or FMV, as you'll hear some people call it, is the price at which a practice would change hands between a willing buyer and a willing seller when neither is under any compulsion to purchase or sell, and both sides have reasonable knowledge of the facts. That definition is largely promulgated by the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS. But for the most part, healthcare transactions are often required to be sold or purchased at fair market value to maintain compliance with the Stark Law and with the anti-kickback statutes. And a practice valuation can be utilized for a variety of reasons, including mergers, acquisitions, and any other buying or selling of the practice. So a qualified appraiser can provide you with a certified opinion as to the fair market value of the subject property interest to be acquired, whether that's the practice itself, the compensation arrangement between the doctor and the practice, etc. And the evaluator will collect numerous data points on the subject property interest, and then take all of that and deliver to you a final report. And that report typically does have either a number attached to it, or it will say that whatever number has been negotiated between the parties is fair market value. So Dr. Satyai, can we mention, before we go any further, some regulatory hoops that a buyer needs to be aware of?
Well, there are a lot of regulatory agencies involved in the enforcement of buying all or part of a practice. The specific actions by these agencies are dependent on the federal and state laws and guidance. So it can vary from state to state also. Some common areas to concentrate on listed on this slide. So for instance, is there a MSO or a management services organization involved? If it is, then it's added an additional wrinkle to the transaction. The practice will then execute a services agreement with the MSO for it to provide administrative and management services to the practice. So that agreement is usually a long-term one. A lot of hospitals, for example, have MSOs, which really provide all the administrative staff, et cetera, separate from the other parts of the administration. So be sure to review the key management agreement provisions. So these could include compensation, fair market value, like we talked about, medical records, the hours and schedules, the employment of licensed professionals that work there, selection of equipment, supplies, third-party payer contracting, certain proprietary information, and of course, clinical care. So in terms of agreements, Ms. Bailey, what kind of agreements then need to be drafted to finalize the purchase once they've agreed generally?
Sure. Even though it's one transaction, there's typically a number of different agreements that need to be drafted. And that's really dictated by the specific facts and circumstances surrounding the transaction. But some of the typical agreements I see that are drafted are either a letter of intent or a term sheet. So that's kind of the jumping off point from which the parties start negotiations. They've already agreed in principle to the transaction, and that kind of memorializes that intent. They may wrap up a non-disclosure agreement within that letter of intent or execute a separate document so that the deal is not disclosed until closing or some other point in time. The definitive agreement itself, of course, which may take the color of a purchase agreement or a shareholder agreement if the surgeon is only buying in as a partner of an established practice. And those definitive agreements can be pretty robust and include a number of different provisions that you'll want to pay special attention to. Some of those provisions will include the representations and warranties, the indemnification clauses or other fundamental representation by either party, post-close cooperation clauses, and certain closing conditions. In addition to that definitive agreement, of course, if you're executing a shareholder agreement, you will likely also execute a promissory note for the amount owed. And then parties will also often draft a common interest agreement, which essentially says if the individuals happen to be sued later on regarding the transaction, they will have a common interest and kind of a let's stick together if that happens agreement. And then the last is a transition services agreement. So as we discussed previously, often the seller will stay on for a little bit of time to help transition patients to the new surgeon partner. And that agreement would dictate the compensation and the duties required of that selling physician during that transition phase. In addition to these agreements, there's also a number of regulatory permits that have to be obtained post-transaction. Anytime a practice undergoes a transaction or a transition, there will nearly always be some sort of notice, consent, application, or other process that you have to engage in with respect to each permit. And by permit, I mean license, certificate of need, certification, provider number, or a filing with any governmental body necessary for the conduct of or relating to the operation of the business that's currently being conducted. And you'll typically, the triggering event is typically what's called a CHOW, a change of ownership. So anytime that change of ownership is occurring in a practice, those types of permits typically need to be filed. Specific types of permits that may also need to be filed include operating permits, equipment permits, material or waste permits, such as those permits for medical waste or radioactive materials, local permits, and then federal permits, such as those needed to comply with the Drug Enforcement Agency's Controlled Substances Act and Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, or CLIA. So, Doctor, can you summarize what the common decision points are in the overall strategy is when purchasing a practice?
So I think we need to go back to the first or second points we made, which is looking at the main decision points, whether the buyer has an interest in. So let's start with whether or not, as a buyer, I'm interested in the entire practice to purchase from another practitioner or a number of them, or purchasing a share of the practice. So that's really important. It changes everything you do. So the other thing would be the entire practice. The common items will include price, but how is the purchase price supposed to be paid back? What are the terms there? Is it cash? Is it based on a bank loan? Is it installments? So that's important. Then a non-compete agreement. If you're buying out somebody, what's to prevent them from going to practice 2 months down the road next door? So that's important. If the seller, for instance, is required to work for a limited time. So if I'm the buyer, I think the senior person or persons are really important to the community and the practice, and the patients know them. I might require them to work there for maybe a year, maybe longer, depending on what their ask is. So this is like any other big business. They will buy somebody out, but require the owner, the previous owner or seller, to work there. So this is an advantage for you to get used to the community and the patients that are coming there. Then if the buy-in is to own a share of the existing practice, then negotiations can be almost every part of the process. So you, like Ms. Bailey mentioned, includes valuation, due diligence, etc. As far as the strategy is concerned, we can talk about the conclusions. What do we conclude in at the end, basically? Probably the main thing as far as strategy is concerned is to really be clear about the acquisition strategy. What kind of practice do you wish to own? And what are your goals to define the type of practice that's ideal for your long-term success and the happiness that you desire from the practice? You have to be pretty clear about this right from the start. So essentially, your goals are driving the strategy. Then the strategy becomes a roadmap for your acquisition initiatives. And it's basically like having a mission statement. You pretty much start at the top and come down and say, this is what's important to me, and this is how I'm going to go through the process. Second, our suggestion is that the buyer, you are only as good as your team. So be sure to recruit your team, whether it's legal counsel, compliance, or your broker, evaluation professional, financial planner, or accountant, right at the outset, so nothing gets missed. For many physicians, this acquisition of a practice may be a lifelong dream, to own or be part of the ownership of a practice. So you should plan to run it the way it should be run. Both of us wish you the very best in this endeavor and wish you great success. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.